Paul had lived in Green Valley all his life, but his journey had been far from easy. At just 5 years old, he lost both of his parents, leaving him with an immense responsibility. His elder sister, Mary, had taken on a motherly role, and his younger brother, Michael, still needed guidance. Though just 21, Paul had become the backbone of his small family, working tirelessly to ensure their survival. Every morning before the sun rose, Paul would make his way to the village market, carefully selecting the freshest vegetables to sell. He knew that the people of Green Valley valued quality, and he took pride in providing them with the best produce available. His workday was divided into two parts. During the day, he pushed his cart through the village, calling out cheerfully to passers-by. And at night, he set up his stall in the small marketplace. His customers trusted him not just for his vegetables, but for his kindness. Unlike other sellers, Paul never rushed anyone. He greeted every customer warmly, inquired about their families, and made sure they left with what they needed. This approach had earned him a loyal following in the village. People would wait specifically for Paul's cart to come by, knowing they would get not just quality vegetables, but also a friendly conversation. However, not everyone in the village was pleased with Paul's success. Two other vegetable sellers, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown, watched enviously as more and more people chose Paul's cart over theirs. They tried everything, lowering their prices, copying his friendly approach, but nothing worked. The villagers still flocked to Paul. Their jealousy soon turned into resentment. They would stand at their stalls, arms crossed, glaring as Paul cheerfully served his customers. They whispered among themselves, plotting ways to undermine his business. "It's not fair," Mrs. Brown would mutter. "We've been selling vegetables in this village for years before that boy came along." Mr. Smith would nod in agreement. "There must be something he's doing that we don't know about. Nobody can be that successful just by being nice." One evening, as Paul packed up his cart, an elderly woman passed by. He had noticed her before, always stopping to ask about prices but never buying anything. This time he decided to speak to her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I see you here every day, but you never buy anything. Is everything all right?" The woman, Mrs. Johnson, looked at him with sad eyes. "Your vegetables are the best in the village, young man, but I have no family to help me. I survive by begging and I cannot afford them." Paul felt a pang of sympathy. He thought about his own struggles and how fortunate he was to have his siblings. Despite their hardships, they had each other. Mrs. Johnson had no one. "Ma'am, from now on, come to my stall every night before I close. I'll give you whatever I have left for free." Mrs. Johnson hesitated. "Oh no, dear boy, I cannot take charity." "It's not charity," Paul assured her. "I have to sell fresh vegetables every day anyway. It would help me as much as it helps you." Reluctantly, Mrs. Johnson agreed. From then on, she visited Paul's store every evening, receiving a bag of fresh produce. Paul always made sure to save some of his best vegetables for her, even on days when business was particularly good. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown, watching from a distance, seethed with rage. Not only was Paul outselling them, but now he was giving away vegetables for free. They decided that Paul had to be stopped. "This is the last straw," Mr. Smith growled one evening, as they watched Mrs. Johnson walk away with her bag of vegetables. "That boy is making us look bad. If people see him giving away food, they'll expect us to do the same." Mrs. Brown nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to teach him a lesson. Show him that he can't just come into our village and take over like this." They hatched a plan to confront Paul on his way home. They knew he always took the same route, a quiet path that wound through a small wooded area on the edge of the village. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. One night, as Paul made his way home along the quiet road, the two sellers stepped out of the shadows. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. Paul's heart skipped a beat when he saw the two figures blocking his way. "So, Paul," Mr. Smith sneered, "you think you're better than us, don't you? You've taken all our customers," Mrs. Brown added bitterly. "And now you're just giving away food like some saint." Paul frowned, trying to stay calm. He had never wanted to make enemies in the village. He was just trying to support his family the best way he knew how. "I'm just doing my job," he said evenly. "If people buy from me, it's because they trust my vegetables." "Well, we've had enough," Mr. Smith growled, taking a step closer. "Leave this village or else." Paul's heart pounded. There was no one around to help him. The road was empty, and the sky was darkening. He thought about his siblings waiting for him at home, about Mrs. Johnson who depended on him. He couldn't leave, but he also didn't know how to stand up to these two angry sellers. Just then, a voice rang out through the darkness. "Help! Somebody help!" It was Mrs. Johnson. She had seen everything from where she was gathering firewood near the path. Her voice, though frail, carried through the quiet evening air. Startled, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown exchanged nervous glances before fleeing into the night. They hadn't expected anyone to witness their confrontation with Paul. Paul, shaken but unharmed, turned to the old woman as she emerged from the trees. "You saved me, ma'am." Mrs. Johnson smiled, her wrinkled face softening in the dim light. "You've been kind to me, Paul. How could I not help?" As they walked back together, Paul realized how vulnerable Mrs. Johnson was living alone in her small cottage. She had risked her safety to help him, despite her own precarious situation. "Ma'am," he said suddenly, "you shouldn't have to live alone. Come stay with us. My siblings and I would love to have you." Mrs. Johnson's eyes glistened with emotion. "Are you sure, dear boy? I wouldn't want to be a burden." "Absolutely," Paul said firmly. "You've become like family to us. And after what you did tonight, how could I let you go back to that empty cottage?" From that night on, Mrs. Johnson lived with Paul and his siblings. She quickly became a beloved part of their household. Mary found comfort in her presence, often seeking her advice on cooking and household matters. Michael adored listening to her stories of the village from long ago, tales of his parents that he was too young to remember. And Paul felt relieved, knowing he wasn't alone in his responsibilities anymore. Mrs. Johnson brought a warmth to their home that had been missing since their parents died. She taught Mary old family recipes that had been passed down through generations in the village. She helped Michael with his schoolwork, showing a patience that Paul sometimes lacked after a long day of selling vegetables. And for Paul, she became a confidante, someone he could share his worries with when the burden of providing for his family felt too heavy. The house, which had once felt empty despite the three siblings, now buzzed with life. Mrs. Johnson's laughter filled the rooms, her gentle humming a constant backdrop as she moved about the kitchen. She insisted on contributing to the household, using her knowledge of herbs to create remedies that she sold to villagers, adding a small but steady income to the family's finances. As for Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown, they never bothered Paul again. Word had spread about their confrontation, and the villagers, already fond of Paul, rallied around him. Business at their stalls dwindled even further, and eventually, they had to find other ways to make a living. Paul's vegetable business continued to thrive. With Mrs. Johnson's help at home, he could focus more on expanding his trade. He started growing some vegetables in the small plot behind their house, reducing his costs and increasing his profits. He even hired a young boy from the village to help him on busy days, paying him fairly and teaching him the value of hard work and kindness. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Paul looked around at his newfound family and smiled. Despite the hardships, he had gained something priceless: love, companionship, and a deeper sense of purpose. "I want to thank you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mary, for being the mother we needed when ours was taken from us. Michael, for your endless optimism that keeps us going even on the hardest days. And Mrs. Johnson, for showing us that family isn't just about blood, it's about who stands by you when you need them most." Mrs. Johnson reached across the table and squeezed Paul's hand. "No, my dear boy, it is I who should thank you. You gave an old woman a reason to live again, a family to love. That is a gift beyond measure." Mary wiped a tear from her eye. "I think our parents would be proud of what we've become, of the family we've built." Michael nodded enthusiastically. "We're the best family in Green Valley." They all laughed at his exuberance, the sound of their joy filling the small house and spilling out into the quiet village night. As the years passed, Paul's reputation in Green Valley only grew stronger. He was known not just as a successful vegetable seller, but as a man of integrity and compassion. People would point to his story as an example of how kindness and hard work could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. And Mrs. Johnson, who had once been alone and forgotten, found herself surrounded by love in her final years. She passed away peacefully in her sleep one winter night, 5 years after moving in with Paul and his siblings. The entire village came to her funeral, a testament to how deeply she had become woven into the fabric of their community. After her death, Paul found a small box under her bed. Inside was a letter addressed to him and his siblings, along with a small pouch of coins, her life savings. The letter read, "My dear children, for that is what you have become to me. When I was alone, you gave me a home. When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was sad, you gave me joy. These coins are all I have to give you in return, but I hope you will use them to remember that the greatest wealth in life is not what we have, but who we have beside us. Love always, your Mrs. Johnson." Paul used the money to buy a small piece of land on the edge of the village. There, he built a larger house for his family and expanded his vegetable garden. He named it Johnson Farm in her honor, and it became known throughout the region for producing the finest vegetables around. Mary eventually married a kind young man from a neighboring village, and they built a small house on the farm. Michael grew up to become a teacher, sharing Miss Johnson's love of stories and knowledge with a new generation of village children. And Paul, though he never married, found fulfillment in the family he had protected and the community he had served. Life is full of challenges, but kindness and hard work always find their way back to us. Paul's success wasn't just about selling vegetables, it was about the trust and goodwill he built with others. Even in the face of jealousy and danger, he remained true to his values. Sometimes life tests us, but if we hold on to our kindness and integrity, we'll find that the universe has a way of rewarding us in ways we never expected. Paul started with nothing but a strong will, yet he gained something far greater than wealth: a loving family and a life filled with purpose. The lesson? Do good, stay honest, and trust that even in the darkest times, light will find its way to you. Just as it did for a young vegetable seller in Green Valley, who opened his heart to an elderly woman and found that in giving, he received more than he could have ever imagined.